This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome, listeners, to Thrive Perspectives. I'm your host, Stu, and today we're exploring the striking rise of Doomsday books, movies, and academic commentary, dealing with collapse, catastrophe, survival, and the end of the world as we know it. Why are these stories everywhere right now? Why do audiences keep returning to visions of ruined cities, failed systems, rogue technology, climate disaster, and desperate communities trying to endure? It reveals something deeper about the human heart, our fear of judgment, our longing for rescue, our awareness that the world is not as it should be, and our hope that history is moving toward more than just chaos. Christianity has always taken the end seriously, but not with the despair that often marks modern apocalyptic stories. Scripture speaks honestly about brokenness, evil, and coming judgment, yet it also points to redemption, resurrection, and the renewal of all things in Christ. Let's join Matt and Connell as we ask what today's doomsday boom tells us about our culture, where it diagnoses real anxieties, where it distorts hope, and how, as Christians, we can respond with clarity, compassion, and confidence. Welcome, Matt. Welcome, Connell.
Welcome, Stuart.
Thrive Perspectives. And an interesting perspective to look at today. Super interesting because I think for a lot of people, whether consciously or subconsciously, the topic we're going to talk about today, I think, is on our minds. The sense of doomsday, the sense of the end of the world, however we want to term that. There's a lot of movies, there's a lot of literature, a lot of books, a lot of commentary even within politics around where the world is headed.
We could say it's sort of lurking, isn't it?
It's lurking, correct.
It's this background reality that lurks behind everything. And I think young people are particularly conscious of it, but it's still lurking because it's difficult to face. And this is the interesting thing about it. A lot of literature discusses we're so used to this and it's unimaginable what anything apart from this might look like. We actually can't really face that reality. So it does become this lurking background reality that we don't really know what to do with.
Yeah.
And I think where we want to get to today, if I can just say this right from the front, is from a Christian point of view, because I know we're going to be talking about what's going to seem a lot of negative stuff, but this is the stuff that feeds our hope.
Yes.
It's this consciousness of the fact that this is temporary. This world order is not the one that God intended.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling the problem is always the gateway to embracing the solution, which is our hope.
Yeah. And if I can say from my own personal experience, I think the last time there was this level of sort of anxiety was when I was probably in my early teens.
Yeah.
With the Cold War, the atomic weapons.
Yeah.
There was a sense of any minute someone could drop a bomb and destroy the world. I know what that was like as a young person. I may have been a little younger than that actually, but as a young person trying to get to sleep at night, wondering if the world was still going to exist.
Yeah. And it really hasn't been until the 20th century that the concept of global catastrophe has become this background, this lurking thing. Now, of course, World War I, it wasn't completely global, but it was a widespread cataclysm, and then World War II. And so it raised this idea of the possibility of everything descending into this sort of chaotic, military state. But it was particularly with the invention of, the atomic bomb. We realized we have the technology to actually destroy our planet.
Yeah.
And that's probably the point at which things become really, really scary. So, I also grew up with films like The Day After and others that kind of flagged the possibility of the incineration of everything that we know and the nuclear winter and it has carried through, hasn't it? Because I recently read Cormac McCarthy's book The Road. Basically, it's a post-apocalyptic nuclear winter. And oh my word, it's the most bleak, the bleakest prospect. So this is the stuff that you're talking about. It's this background reality that films and books like this, they're trying to bring from a background I don't know always why they do this. I actually think that as Christians, we can actually bring the background into the present. It's because there's a sense in which we know where the story goes. This is very important. We know where the story goes. We know that things don't go well with the world system, which is cast as sort of symbolically as Babylon in the book of Revelation. There's this kind of proclamation, Babylon has fallen, Babylon has fallen. And so there is this sense that the world system as such goes bad and crumbles in some sense, right? We don't exactly know how, we don't know the drivers for that. But in our time, what is described there actually looks increasingly possible at a global level.
And I think the added thing, that we bring into this now, as opposed to in our day when we were growing up, where it was largely around someone who was a bit trigger happy, perhaps. Now we've got all these other things that we have, to some degree, less and less agency over, like rogue technology that we build things that are beyond our ability to control them. Climate disaster, which is not a single effort by one person. It's just a growing challenge that we have as a planet. So there's all these things mounting.
A lot of things we can't control. But I think the other thing is, when I was growing up, I certainly was aware of that anxiety, the dark clouds almost that are just hanging in the background. I think we all grow up, we all live with that. But I think when we look at it now, what happens with increasing technology and the way that geopolitics plays out and our ability we're no longer just separated in our own little countries, isolated. The potential is exponentially
global,
growing in our capacity to do that. So there's a lot of forces that are sort of coming back against us and making those clouds just seem even more present. I think for a lot of people, in just increasing that level of anxiety it's almost in the back of our mind.
It keeps compounding too, because let's, summarize the factors that play into this. Of course, we talk about, when we were growing up, the nuclear threat was the ever-present thing. And I mean, even thinking about how many nuclear weapons there are in the world, it's ridiculous. Yeah. It's ridiculous that we have these weapons that are literally like a self-destruct button for the Earth. And that is actually that we even have that
capability.
Yeah. And I know there's anti-proliferation treaties, all this sort of thing happening. There is an insanity. It's like we've put a kind of suicide machine, a collective suicide machine right next to us as a human race. So there's a sort of insanity associated with that. So there's that. Of course, the next big thing has, of course, been climate change. And this has been something that's been flagged since about the 70s. It was probably in the 90s and the 2000s that this started to become more urgent. A lot of Christians resist this, and it's a weird one because we should expect theologically that human beings would make a mess of our environment. Yeah. So the Christian climate denial has been a strange creature to me. And I think it's because it gets caught up with politics. It's seen as being a sort of leftist political agenda. I think that's unfortunate because, again, it seems, fundamentally theologically sound to expect that we would wreck the environment, the perfectly balanced environment that God created. Now, just to sort of map this issue, if I may, we live, broadly speaking, in a sort of, for the last 10,000 years, in a period known as the Holocene. And the Holocene is since the last ice age. And this is this period of kind of ideal stability that has enabled, consistent seasons. And it's all, I find it all very biblical because it feels like
pattern.
Yeah, it feels like, the biblical story of God creating the environment such that, was right for human life. And so, scientists can call it the Holocene. I call it God creating this space for human beings to live, and the seasons and everything operates. It's the sort of the Goldilocks zone, what is in a broader picture referred to as the Goldilocks zone. There's kind of a environmental Goldilocks period, I guess, or epoch known as the Holocene, that atmospheric conditions as well, the temperature, the seasons, all of these things working together to create this environment that allows for this ideal human life. Now, what climate scientists say is from roughly the 1800s, we enter a period in which human beings significantly alter that environment. And it's actually been referred to as the Anthropocene, which is kind of flagging the fact that we've upset this perfect balance and we're entering into another period that we don't really know the consequences of it yet. And so, so the ideal environmental conditions are, roughly sort of 280 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. And actually, a Christian environmentalist called Bill McKibben wrote a book called Earth in 2010. Earth is spelled E-A-R-T-H because he's wanting to flag the fact that we've got something different than we had before now. And so the subtitle of the book is Making Life on a Tough New Planet. So he's flagging the fact that we're in an environment now that we haven't been before. He started an organization called 350.org because he said the outer limit of what can sustain what we have is 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And he said, once we get past that, we're in a kind of unknown. He goes through a lot of things that may become the case, destabilizing climate and climate patterns and all of the consequences on that. It's quite a doomsday picture. But it's interesting to note that that was in 2010, and he starts this organization 350 to try to slow down the acceleration. We are now at 420, I think 428 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. So we're in unknown territory. And I think this is the thing, it's the unknown in all of this that is part of the problem. There's a famous book published by Penguin by a guy called David Wallace Wells called the title is telling. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth. So David Wallace Wells' thesis is basically, he's arguing that climate change is worse than people imagine. So this is 2019 book. He's basically saying it's too difficult for us to face. The problem with the discussion around it is that we naturally are going to live in denial because the implications are so beyond anything that we can imagine.
But I think in this sort of doomsday storytelling that we do like to tell,
I'm not sure if we like to tell it, but it is being told.
But it's being told in the movies and the books, which is what we said at the start. There is a tendency for us to lean into this. And I think you can be a denier that certain realities exist, but you can also go the other way, which is to really sort of get on board and peddle the doomsday aspect of it and build a whole narrative around it. So I think there's one way we can characterize certain people as being deniers. I think people are right, though, to separate or be concerned with the politics mixed into it, because in the midst of all of that is a lot of power, control the narrative.
Politics always goes awry in crisis,
and so that's
historically.
And I think that's where a lot of people are coming from, is that separating the truth, like what is the reality of the situation? Because there's so many different opinions in there. I don't really know. I'm not a denier. I'm not necessarily, personally, I'm not on board that whole doomsday scenario that a lot of other people want you sort of to buy into.
Well, in a way we do theologically, biblically, except we say it's going to be much worse than anyone imagines. So what Revelation presents and what, Peter talks about when he talks about the elements being burned up it's way worse.
Yes. So there's a theological aspect of it that, we're going to mess the environment up. That's a realistic kind of thing.
So the political thing is just because lots of things, let me put it this way, human beings routinely instrumentalize things in bad ways. So even the Christian faith has been instrumentalized in bad ways. So here is a scenario in which things are going badly. The climate has been badly affected by human beings. And I think theologically, I'm saying that's something that we should expect to be the case. We shouldn't be surprised by that we wreck our environment. Now, of course, different people are going to instrumentalize these things in different ways. But just because people instrumentalize it for their own political ends, it doesn't discount the actual facts themselves.
And what do you do with those facts? There's so many questions out of it. That's even creating anxiety in itself because it's reorganizing.
Well, what you do about those facts is if you live in a world and you don't subscribe to a Christian worldview, then you have to say with Marx that everything is political. You know what I mean? So there's only political solutions. For us, politics isn't the solution. It's something like palliative care for the human predicament, right? So the solution is bigger than that. So it inevitably becomes political if you don't have a bigger view.
And I think I would argue that once you get the politics involved with it, the facts get distorted. And
absolutely.
And then we build the narratives around it that we want to tell, and then inevitably certain narratives win, and then they become dominant, and then you don't really know what is actually real and what isn't.
And I think the only thing we're really speaking to here is that the science tells us we're at a level of parts per million in the atmosphere that we've never been to before. Mm-hmm. So we really don't know, like you say. Yeah. And the question is, do we sit back and do nothing about that, or do we do something about it? And that's where the argument comes, because the two different sides of politics and people have different perspectives on how we should try to address that. I think the bigger question is, I think from a Christian perspective, as you say, Matt, I don't think we commonly think that it's going to get worse. I think there's somehow an inherent thing in the way that we think, or in certain Christians I talk to, who think somehow the world is going to get better. Well, it is, but not until it's got a lot
and that's
worse.
because the progress narrative is so deeply built into our civilization, and this is probably...
But also the survival narrative, I think it's those two things.
Yeah.
But I think climate change has been obviously a major thing in our radar over the last few years. It's no doubt that's been creating a lot of anxiety in people as well in terms of what it means. But I'm kind of seeing the shifts now where that's almost being pushed into the background. The forces are there. That the climate's now maybe not the biggest issue, or there's less that we can even do about it, because now the race, just in the last couple of years, is around energy and the absolute thirst and hunger for energy in the world.
To feed AI in reality.
To feed AI that now is going to make...
which compounds the environmental thing
which compounds all of that, and that becomes we don't need to go too far down the AI rabbit hole, but that in itself was almost like a struggle going on now for almost like control of the world, the whole world economy. Like AI is going to be running the world economy probably in the next few years in increasing scale. And with that race for energy, it's driving military, the economics of the world, and we're all trying to get control. We're all trying to get power. We've talked about that. That's the driving dynamic in everything. And now that's allowing people to do that on a scale that's unprecedented. You know, there's all sorts of doomsday scenarios that people are talking about in there as well. And again, which way is it going to go? I don't know. The potential for major societal structural change is just unbelievable now, where we could potentially see 2 or 3 companies essentially hold the economy of the whole world in their hands, even surpassing country boundaries. We've never seen anything like it before. And the drive for that with energy, the world has never seen the energy demands that it needs now.
So to help just keep, because we could talk about the issues, but I think one of the things we probably want to really talk about is why, from a cultural perspective, there seems to be so much more storytelling, books, documentaries, movies around this theme, because you would think if it was creating anxiety, that the thing you'd want to do is minimize it. But the commentary that I've read, as I've tried to do a bit of research on why this kind of influx over the last probably 10 years, but increasingly the last 5 years on these sort of doomsday books and movies and the likes, is that because there's a recognition now that it is out of control, there's not much we can do about this. We need to create movies that help people feel like we still have agency, we still have control, there's a plot, this is what happens, the end is good, it's okay. And because people feel anxious, they want to go to a movie that actually at the end of it, when they walk out, goes, oh, it all worked out okay in the end. And this is why there seems to be this insatiable kind of demand for this type of material right now.
So, and that goes back to something that we've talked about before. As human beings, we understand our lives in a narrative sense. So we tell stories. So if I go back to something that you said before, Connell, you talked about, you know, how when things get politicized, the facts get distorted. I'm not sure. I mean, facts are units of information. I'm not sure you can distort the parts per million thing, or like, I think it's dangerous to say that, because I think we have to be open to there being certain facts. But the key thing is the story that we tell on the basis of the facts.
Yes.
And that is where I think probably it's more at that level that perhaps, political stories come into it. Because I think that there are a lot of dangers, and I don't, because I don't, particularly from a Christian point of view, I don't want us to join the, oh, no, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, human beings are going to sort it out. That sort of thesis that, for example, is that of Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now, a book called Enlightenment Now, where he says, look, through human technological process, we've made the world better. I know we face problems. This is a very crude summary. I know we have serious problems, but we'll be equal to the task. Like we'll solve our problems. We always have. We're the most adaptable creatures. That progress narrative is there, and it is something that we hold on to. So I think, Stu, what you're saying there is, even with that in the background, I think the way that we cope with that is to come back to this belief
that it's going to be okay.
This background that surely things are going to be okay, that's some kind of progress narrative. And the problem is when that comes down to human beings solving their own problems. And that's, all of the Doomsday books, they do offer some solutions. They talk about slowing it down and all these sorts of things. Yuval Noah Harari, in his books, he does address the problems with civilization. And he's, kind of faces the inherent sort of systemic problems. But he does end up kind of by saying technology is just going to be this exponential curve. But he's also realistic enough. In fact, he says his book Homo Deus is putting forward the idea that we are going to become like gods. We're going to have godlike control over our environment. But there's an ambivalence in his forward look. He sees that it's quite possible that technology comes with its own problems.
Yeah.
And we don't really know what they are, which is coming back to what you say. We have to keep coming back to the biblical story, because we do have a story that involves both demise and progress. It has both of those things. And you think, how can it be both? See, the political story tends to polarize to either side of those things, perhaps. But the biblical story has the demise of the world, the humanly built world system that is essentially compensatory in nature. And this is interesting to think about. It's not that technology is inherently bad, but we could see it as compensatory in nature. It's compensating for what has been lost through the fall. And so I think we can see inherent problems, and we can face those problems as Christians, because I think the Bible, like, for example, in the letter of John, when he says, do not love the world or anything in the world, because the world and its desires are passing away, right? Let alone going to Revelation, where it pictures the collapse of the world system, say world system, not the dissolution of the space-time universe, but the dissolution of the world system. And then Peter talks about the burning up of, things. And it looks like a kind of purging, but we look forward, he says, to a new heavens and a new earth. Now, that's the important bit. We look forward to a new heavens and new earth. And that's our hope. But hope is grounded in a realistic view of the present. Paul says in Romans chapter 5, suffering produces perseverance, which produces character, which produces hope, right? And suffering does that because it acquaints us in a first-hand way with the human predicament, right? We feel the brokenness of ourselves and the world. When we feel that, it produces hope, because we're reminded, this, including our own bodies, this is passing away, right? This is temporary. These bodies are mortal, they're going to die. And we could apply that to the world system. The world system is mortal. It's going to die. And we can apply the palliative care, the political palliative care, but it's just palliative care. So I think we can face this and even draw from, I guess, the alarms that are being sounded, and I'm talking about in non-fiction literature. I think we can listen to that and nod our heads without being surprised, and actually take that on board, not in a pessimistic way, but in the sense that we would also look to our own passing away. And there is a tragedy, yes, absolute tragedy, that Jesus wept in the face of death. But then you've got the Apostle Paul saying, for me, it is better to go and be with Christ. And so there's a sense in which death leads to something better, and therein lies our hope. I have followed the proliferation of, and I'm talking in the more scholarly space, the Doomsday literature that's come out. Now if I can just do a little bit of a survey, just to give some specifics on kind of what people are saying. So there has been a trend of recognizing within our civilization, because we have since the sort of 1700s, 1800s, particularly in the 1900s, there was a bit of pessimism sown into this in the 20th century for obvious reasons, but there was this sense that civilization is the answer. You know, there's the Thomas Hobbes thesis that before civilization came along, human beings were in a state that was short, nasty, brutish, and, you know, it was just this terrible, and civilization sort of saves the day. So that thesis is being questioned on all sides, saying, well, actually, civilization. And when we talk civilization, we're talking roughly from where the Bible places the story of Cain. You know, Cain builds the first city, and it's not that it's all bad, but there is a sense in the Bible in which the Bible problematizes civilization also. You know, think the Tower of Babel, Cain building this, Cain building the city, then the Tower of Babel, that this is human beings compensating, this is human beings playing God in a sense.
But there's a sense, though, that every time we do anything, maybe we temporarily make it better, but it ends up changing the trajectory of something else, and then
its own problems.
It causes its own problems.
Just what I was going to say. I mean, even if you go back to the atomic weapons, you know, they became the deterrent to the point where there's so many of them, it's actually a risk. And I think if we move that way forward to AI, it has a huge amount to help us, but I think ultimately it's going to be our problem.
There's a very famous article by Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond is Pulitzer Prize-winning author, wrote a very famous book called Guns, Germs and Steel. But he wrote a famous article, you can get this online, where he talks about the Neolithic revolution, so the move to sort of pastoral kind of mass domestication of crops and you know, animals and people living in cities. And he casts that as the greatest disaster that ever befell mankind because it caused widespread environmental disaster. And Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Sapiens, he also jumps on this bandwagon. Number of other prominent authors are doing this, recognizing that there are deep problems. And so they talk about things like the beginnings of most of the diseases that we face go back to us living in close proximity in city. It's this sort of unnatural kind of... Again, the Bible, I think, sees that as problematic in one sense in the story of Cain and the story of Babel. But on the other hand, it's not all bad because there's a sense of that being redeemed in the end because, of course, in Revelation 22, you have the holy city, the New Jerusalem, right? But there is this sense, I mean, they even talk about the changes in human physiology, that the different form of life. They actually even talk about the beginning of birth pains. The question is being asked, why do we of all creatures experience such extreme problems with birthing? And they talk about the sort of changes in human physiology associated with that.
I'm just thinking, because we painted there, like, for example, in the Neolithic period and the change to being able to farm for our food and so on. There's obviously problems that come with that. And one of the ones is the fact that, well, we have food always sort of readily available to us. So that causes us to behave differently. We don't have to work so hard to go out and eat every single day. So there's a sense of self-sufficiency in that, which comes with different problems, but also even just being able to work. So we all have to go to the gym now just to keep our muscles from disappearing. It's just like, but they're not necessarily bad things. Like you even mentioned about living in close community. God didn't say don't live in close community, but it's almost like a sense of just everything that we do.
No, these guys are talking about living in walled cities where you live with your animals because someone else is going to steal them. So it's that sort of hoarding mentality. You know, we're enclosing all that we have rather than allowing the normal sort of ecological dissemination of species.
But that's always going to happen because humans want to take and become, and so that's,
that's right.
So therefore, the solution to that is we need to live in walled cities. So it's like living in the walled city The point I'm trying to make is...
And which we still live in walled cities. I mean, effectively,
It's like everything we do. It's it's causing everything to... You can imagine it's sort of like reverberating.
That's right.
Literally everything, good and bad. There's a lot of good things that we do.
What does Scripture say? All nature groans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the discussion moves then from this sense that, okay, civilization, this thing that we thought was the answer for all, this human-created thing, because it's like this is the answer, civilization, so we need to go out and civilize, supposedly uncivilized societies. Now, I think it's important to recognize there are a lot of really good things in our civilization. This is, Steven Pinker wants us to realize things are a lot better now. Like we live in at least some of us live in a lot more comfort. And I think it's important to recognize that there has been a lot of progress. But the other thing we should recognize is the role of the Christian movement in creating that environment. So there's also a massive body of literature increasingly pointing out that this is the result of a way of thinking that was seeded by the Christian movement. So, books like Tom Holland's Dominion, Larry Siedentop's Inventing the Individual, even a book called The Weirdest People in the World, which talks about a psychological kind of what led to the psychology that underlies our ability to cooperate at a mass level. And it goes back to, again, it goes back to the Christian movement, even though these are not books written by Christians.
Yeah.
So there certainly is a sense in which it's a little bit like when Jeremiah says to the Jewish exiles, they're going to exile in Babylon. And he says, when you go there, go and participate, pray for the peace and the prosperity of that city and work for the peace and prosperity of that city because you want to be a blessing wherever you go. And in a sense, the Christian movement and actually the kingdom of God has been like yeast through the dough. It's changed human psychology. It's allowed for mass cooperation. It's allowed for development. It's, according to, Rodney Stark in his writings, historian and sociologist who traces a lot of scientific, technological development back to the Christian worldview, and that's been widely supported by people like Alfred North Whitehead and others. So there are these seeds of prosperity and truth sort of empowering this civilization, and yet it's like there is blessing at work in Babylon, but it's still Babylon and it still gets instrumentalized for the wrong purposes.
I think it's a temporary illusion, not even an illusion, it's real. But it's like, I think we've aligned ourselves that allowed us to organize ourselves as a society, government structures and laws and the rule of law and systems.
It's a taste, because that's a biblical idea to talk about a sort of a taste of the future. So it's the already and the not yet, which is a big theological theme, this idea that in the present. So for example, if I pray for you and you're healed, that's a taste of something.
Yeah.
But it's not the fullness because you're still going to die and your ultimate healing is going to be in the resurrection. So in a sense, what is seeded into this otherwise rebellious human structure that we call civilization, it's the world system as it's referred to in the New Testament. When it talks about the world, it's talking largely about the world system. So it's still on a doomed trajectory, but the seeds of blessing are in it as a taste of something better.
But I think we've carved a period of history. A lot of people recognize that this period, certainly probably since World War II to now, probably had the most peaceful period ever. Although,
is it? And the question is it the calm before the storm?
Yeah. That's the point I'm trying to make. Is I think we've carved out a period where we've been able to enjoy that.
Yeah.
We've organized ourselves well according to some good principles. But now, like everything we do, we end up just corrupting it. And now we've actually created the tools and things like that to now launch the next phase of where we actually completely corrupt it with even greater
calamity.
The problem is now that in these last decades, with all of that sense of self-sufficiency and relative calm, then obviously, as a society, we've lost the dependence on God and become more dependent on ourselves. So that's going to shift. That's coming home to roost.
Maybe to use another metaphor, a biblical one to describe that process, because I think it is, we are on the back of a remarkable period of sort of roughly the last 70, 80 years, right? But think about what's happened. I think it's an example of that kind of weeds and wheat scenario. the parable of the weeds and the wheat is a situation where both grow together. And in a way, we have this period that has been a fertile period, but it's a fertile period for both weeds and wheat. The Princeton historian Mark Knoll says in a book about the changing shape of the Christian world movement, and he says at the start of that book, he says that the Christian movement has experienced a more rapid and wide geographical redistribution in the last 50 years. He's writing in about, 2010 or something, than in any other comparable period in history. So he talks about the dissemination from about the 1950s. There was a rapid spread of Christianity throughout the global Southeast. And, he traces this. So there's plenty of work to do, but there's been a rapid spread of Christianity within this period of peace, right? It's sort of enabled that. So it's enabled the wheat, but it's also enabled weeds, because we have this situation now where this period that I referred to as the Anthropocene, they actually talk about from the 1950s, an acceleration from the 1950s. So the same period has also accelerated all the problems that are leading to, global climate change as well. And you add to that, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So you see in this period that we've perhaps coming to the end of, I mean, that's what the feeling is. I think that's what we're addressing in this episode, is the fact that there's a widespread feeling that we're coming to the end of this period of peace and prosperity, that this feels like the calm before a storm. And I should say that, writers like Jared Diamond, for example, in his book Collapse, he says, and I quote, "Globalization makes it impossible for modern societies to collapse in isolation, as did Easter Island and the Greenland Norse in the past." So he gives examples of the collapses of society. He says, "Any society in turmoil today, no matter how remote, can cause trouble for prosperous societies on other continents, and is also subject to their influence, whether helpful or destabilizing. For the first time in history, we face the risk of a global decline." So the idea is that we're now in a global situation. And of course, the globalization has been a phenomenon that has allowed mass cooperation at a scale that we've never seen before. And that is a feature of the last 70 or 80 years as well. But it's also potentially, he's saying that what it means is that everything's linked. Coupled. So when the thing falls, it's all going to fall together. Yeah.
And I think also what a new thing that I'm seeing too with AI particularly is trying to figure out what is the value of being a human? What is our identity? Because whether we like it or not, we're all measured on the output that we produce. That's not biblical, but that's the world that we live in. And so now we see AI is actually moving into the space of doing all our work for us. And listening to different commentators on this subject and trying to postulate where this is all going to go, that's one of the big questions is, well, where actually does it leave us as humans? So I think even like the first time in history, we're now asking the question, what is actually human identity? What is our value? If a machine can do everything, we've got machines to do all our physical labor for us. We've got machines now for the first time in the history of the world that can actually do the intelligent thinking work, which we thought was just humans that could do that. What are we going to be doing? So it actually calls into question, we have to ask the question, what is the human identity? And you can look at that and be really pessimistic about it and go, man, I'm not going to have a job. What's everyone going to be doing? But I'd kind of look at it and I go, I think God's doing something, because I think he's putting his finger on a point that we need to confront.
Could we say he's bringing the infection to the surface?
I think so.
We've enjoyed a period of peace. When we say someone has cancer and it goes into remission, perhaps there's been a sense of remission, or we've enjoyed a period in which we haven't been limited or as affected by the full extent of the human predicament, but the infection is there, and there's a sense in which we haven't really felt it. So, this has also been a period in which we've experienced mass secularization. So if you look at, statistics of people and religious, affiliation, and we've seen a decline in that. But as you're saying, I think what we're seeing in churches now is a lot of people asking these very questions, and I think this is going to increase. It's interesting. There's a new book out by a guy called Paul Kingsnorth, and he is a prominent journalist and environmentalist. And his book, Against the Machine, which was published already a few years ago, but I started reading this book, and it starts with reflections on Genesis. I'm thinking, Paul, what's going on? What's going on? Anyway, I discovered that he's actually become a Christian. Sort of joins the ranks of a lot of public intellectuals that have become Christians. And I've heard this in a lot of different areas. In fact, one of the biggest sort of philosophical critics of civilization is a guy called John Zizan, and I actually got in contact with him at one stage and said, I sent him an email and said, that a lot of your writing has resonances with biblical eschatology, the fact that we've messed things up. And he himself says in his writings, that there is a sense of this in the Bible, a sense of a time when things were right, and this sense of human beings wrecking things. And so he sort of points to that, but he doesn't show any religious commitment. Some of his writings is quite critical of Christianity, but he actually, when he wrote back, he said, I'm starting to realize that more and more. And he says he's been reading, and he cited some books, Christian books that he'd been reading. And I thought, wow, isn't it interesting that as this accelerates, it does get people asking these questions because we're feeling the symptoms.
You could ignore it before, because we're all self-sufficient. We've invented our own idea of what value. We don't have to confront it. When I look inside my own, try to understand, how do I feel about this? I feel the tension, the anxiety of the world, and go, what's going to happen here? I just don't know. But on the other side, I also get this sense of hope in it, in the sense that I think God's doing something. We're bringing these things to the surface. It's not just in the church. Every person in society is going to be asking the question, what is my value as a human being? There's probably no greater question for people that we would want society. Yeah. And that's the question that every single person is going to be forced to confront, the reality of that. And that, to me, that's fantastic. That's great. I kind of think, bring it on. It's part of the mission. It's the whole reason that we're here.
And as you say, you rightly say, God is doing something in the midst of it. And that really is the message of the book of Revelation, because it depicts all of this turmoil. But the perspective of the book of Revelation is that this is not out of control. The big perspective and the big message is that God is sovereign and at work. He's in some ways accelerating certain aspects of this. You think of aspects of the book of Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse and these things, where it's God compounding the problems, bringing the problems to the surface so that they're felt, so that people will cry out to God and seek God. And so that theme in Revelation, it feels more evident in our environment. It feels, because this feels more global, it feels like destabilization, and there is a sense of instability. There's environmental instability, there is economic and political instability. And so when we feel instability, we go looking for the thing that feels solid. What is the constant? And the book of Revelation, the message of that is the constant is that in heaven there is a God who is being worshipped, and the scroll of world history has been given to the Lamb, to Christ the Lamb, and he rules. Christ rules now. It's not just a future thing. Christ is ruling over history. He's in the control room. He was deemed worthy to receive the scroll, right? And so he has control of world history. So it's not out of control. There is a bigger story, and I think we're going to see people reaching for that. I therefore think, because I think we can move to how, as Christians, what our role is in this environment. I think the last thing that we want to be doing is saying peace, peace when there is no peace. This is Jeremiah's criticism in the book of Lamentations. The prophet Jeremiah criticizes the false prophets, that when Jerusalem was falling, they said, no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine.
Yeah.
God promised that this would never happen, and it's going to be fine. And I think, I feel like Christian climate denial is like that. I know it's a strong statement, but it's like, it's this, no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. I mean, it's one thing to problematize the solutions, the political solutions that get off. Absolutely. Go to town, because our solutions actually aren't solutions. And that applies to both sides of politics. Political solutions are palliative care. They're not solutions. So it's easy to find problems in the solutions, but to deny
that there's a problem,
that there is even a problem at that scale, and that it's linked to human beings, I think is fundamentally antagonistic towards a biblical perspective, and also this idea of taking responsibility as human beings. I mean, God wants us to take responsibility. If there's something wrong with our world, it's our fault. That's a theological fundamental. It comes back to human beings.
That applies
in one
to
sense
all things.
or
That
another.
applies to everything.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I had a conversation. I mentioned climate change once. This is years ago to someone, and in fact, it was in another country. And he just said, "Oh no, I don't believe in all that. I don't think the climate." The problem with that is that it essentially disables us from actually speaking to a world that is concerned. People asking, "We've messed this up." It's like people are admitting this. We have made a mess of our world. And we as Christians want to say, amen, yes, you have. It's like Acts chapter 2, when they heard Peter's message, they were cut to the heart and said, what must we do to be saved? I mean, the last thing that we want to be doing, saying, no, it's fine, everything's fine, it's all overcooked. It's not overcooked. Actually, my view is, from a biblical point of view, it's actually much worse than people think. We're reading off what we see, but we also know that it's going to talk about being politically instrumentalized. That goes bad for sure. Paul talks about in Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness, and you've got the beast of Revelation. We know that it goes bad, right? And yet we have hope. And this I think is the big thing, because we are pointing people to hope. We are heralds of the hope of what Jesus is doing, the hope that Jesus is in control. And there's an interesting and importantly polarized picture in the book of Revelation, because on the one hand, you have things going awry on earth, the collapse of Babylon, but in the heavens, and the saints and the multitude in white robes are rejoicing, right? Saying, yay, to summarize, hooray,
judgment on
praise God, because Jesus is in control, right? We've won. It's like, and so there's this polarization that kind of feeds that hope, because hope is, I've often said there's two ways of losing your hope. One is to not have anything beyond this to look to. And this is where I think this is what we're experiencing. I mean, a lot of young people today are looking towards the future saying, why bother? I mean, it feels so hopeless because they don't have anything beyond this to look to. So that's one way of losing your hope. And in this environment, we need to be heralds of hope. We need to be speaking to the concern, not arguing with people, but saying, just generally speaking, and I'm not saying all aspects of the diagnosis are right, okay? But yes, we do have a terminal problem, right, that we're not going to be able to fix, which gets back to my point that it's actually worse than the Doomsday literature is saying, because they're still saying, we can fix this, we can fix this. No, not so much. We can agree, we can say amen to that, but that becomes the darkness in which the light shines brightly, right? We can actually shed the light of hope in that circumstance. So that's a form of loss of hope that we're experiencing in our society. But another form of loss of hope, whereas the first one is not having anything beyond this to look forward to, the other form of loss of hope is that you don't look forward to anything because you're so deluded by a sense of false security, and you're so comfortable with this, so anesthetized to the problem that you don't look beyond this to anything else. That is another form of loss of hope. And I think we're in danger of both of those things. I think we're perhaps more in danger of the because what we tend to do is that we anesthetize ourselves with entertainment. We just shut it all out. And so that is another form. And I think even, Christians can be complicit in this too. We get so comfortable with this that we don't look forward.
Within myself, I'm always in two minds. One, I feel the anxiety, and one, I kind of feel the hope. as well that's associated with it, and I want to embrace it. And I kind of think, why do I feel that anxiety? And to me, that's within myself is my own investment that I have in this world, in the world systems. And my own,
we all are.
and my own wealth. I'm still hanging on for dear life. You know, I feel like my nails are dug in. I'm losing control, and I can see how I'm going to lose control. I can see there's a whole lot of threats, and so my normal reaction is to go, "What's going to happen here?" You know, this is something I'm going to allow for me to have fear over, and that's the reality. If you don't have a Christian worldview as this alternative, I see it as almost like a war in my own mind of there's the fear and the anxiety on one side, but another side going, yeah, I'm going to embrace it. I actually want to feel that. I want to feel the fear and the anxiety, and then
which is what makes you embrace, correct.
And make me embrace even more.
The only hope there is.
The only hope and the mission. The whole point I'm here is not to enjoy those things. The whole point, why would I not want these things to happen? I don't want them to happen because I don't want people to suffer. But if God's in control, these things need to happen. And as a society,
as Jesus said, these things must take place.
They must take place, and they're going to have to happen. And what an opportunity is going to present itself to actually force society to finally acknowledge the problems that we do have. And I can embrace that now, and I can see it in myself, my own reluctance to embrace that. And so there's a war in myself of anxiety of trying to retain control, but then, no, I need to grab hold of this that God is doing.
Yeah. And I think that's true for all of us. And Matt, as we wrap up, I think it speaks strongly to Jesus' words, unless you're willing to give up everything, you cannot follow me.
Yeah, I think the thing to underline at the end is how to respond to this. So you said, Connell, about us being invested in this world system, and that's not a bad thing. We're meant to be. We're meant to contribute. We're meant to be part of it. So we're not meant to withdraw into an enclave. Like we're not doomsday preppers. We don't move out of society and sort of cushion ourselves. No, we get involved. And so everyone that has a superannuation account is kind of hoping that will accrue and all of the rest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're sort of conflicted, aren't we? Because like on the one hand, we want things to go well, but in another sense, we know that it is going to crumble at some point, and that there is something better beyond this. And I think that tension is okay. It's that theological idea of the already and the not yet, which is such an important part of our worldview. This sense that there is so much blessing, and God loves to bless us, and we can enjoy the good things in this world with gratitude to God. So that's fine, right? And we also should contribute and be part of, sowing in peace and prosperity wherever we can into our society. We should contribute, but we do that with a bigger view. So we can invest and benefit, but we don't put our hope in what we're investing and benefiting from in terms of the world system. Our hope is in God and what God is doing. We don't know. I think it's very important to say we don't know how things are going to unfold. I mean, in discussions around, AI and climate change and all these sorts of things, I actually quite like it when people say we really don't know what's going to happen, because specifically we don't. I mean, from a Christian point of view, however, in a broad sense, we do know what's going to happen. We know that Christ is going to return. We know that there is going to be ultimately, there might be some other things that happened in the meantime, but we know that ultimately there will be a new heavens and a new earth, that this world will be returned to the perfect state. We ourselves will live forever in resurrected bodies and new heavens and a new earth. And that is the hope, that is the Christian hope that we have through Christ. And I think we should, on the one hand, allow ourselves to feel the problem. That should motivate us not to withdraw, but to engage with the mission that we have. It should remind us that we are the field doctors in a hopeless society. We are the lights in the darkness of hopelessness, and do not deprive people of your hope. Open your heart. Talk about the hope that you have, we're told repeatedly. We have a testimony to the hope that we have through Jesus Christ. Now is a time to talk about that, because people, I believe, are open in a new and significant way. We're experiencing this. This is part of trusting that God is in control. Be bold, open up your heart, share boldly about the hope that is in you, and look forward to what God is going to do.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.